Congratulations, you've just awakened as a common citizen in Pompeii, the jewel of the Roman Empire, nestled in the fertile shadow of Mount Vesuvius. It's a crisp morning in early 79 AD. The streets are bustling with opportunity, and you're about to experience one of history's most vibrant cities at its absolute peak. The good news: you're living in an era of unprecedented Roman prosperity. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments, surrounded by magnificent architecture, flowing aqueducts, and the most advanced civilization the world has ever known. The bad news? You probably won't survive the next 24 hours, not because of any volcanic eruption, but because daily life in ancient Pompeii is a minefield of diseases, dangers, and deadly social pitfalls that would destroy any modern person within hours. You open your eyes in a cramped, windowless room, barely larger than a modern closet. The air hits you like a physical assault, thick with smoke from oil lamps, the acrid smell of urine from the chamber pot in the corner, and the overwhelming stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste that permeates every surface. Your bed is nothing more than a straw mattress crawling with fleas, bed bugs and lice that have already begun their feast on your modern, unaccustomed skin. The welts and bites covering your arms and legs itch with an intensity that would drive most people to madness. But this is just the beginning of your ordeal. You're Gaius Brutidius, a freedman, a former slave who has earned his liberty but remains trapped in the bottom tier of Roman society. Your tiny room sits above a fullonica, a laundry and cloth dyeing establishment, in one of Pompeii's most crowded insulae multi-story apartment buildings that house the working poor. The walls around you are paper thin, and already you can hear the cacophony that will assault your senses for the next 16 hours. Crying babies, arguing couples, the violent coughing of the tubercular man next door, and the constant creaking and groaning of a building that seems perpetually on the verge of collapse. As you attempt to stand, your bare feet touch the cold, filthy floor, a mixture of packed earth, animal dung tracked in from the streets, and mysterious stains that you don't want to identify. There's no running water in your room, no bathroom, no privacy. Most residents simply use chamber pots or, more commonly, relieve themselves in the streets, adding to the ankle-deep mixture of sewage, garbage, and mud that flows through Pompeii's thoroughfares. The walls of your room are damp with condensation and black with mold that would trigger severe respiratory reactions in any modern person within hours. Ancient Romans had no understanding of hygiene as we know it. They believed that bad smells caused disease, not germs, so they attempted to mask odors with strong perfumes and incense rather than eliminating their sources. The result is a toxic soup of airborne pathogens, parasites, and allergens that your modern immune system has never encountered and cannot possibly handle. You stumble toward the single small opening that serves as your window, an unglazed hole in the wall with no glass, no screen, nothing to keep out the elements or the vermin. Below you, the Via dell'Abbondanza stretches out in both directions, already alive with the deadly dance of Roman street life. Ox-drawn carts lumber through the narrow passages, their drivers whipping both animals and pedestrians with equal indifference. Shopkeepers dump buckets of wastewater and refuse directly into the street from second-story windows, creating a constant rain of filth that pedestrians must dodge or endure. The stepping stones that allow people to cross the streets without wading through the sewage are slippery with algae and waste, causing regular falls that result in broken bones, head injuries, and worse. You watch a well-dressed merchant slip and tumble into the muck, immediately attracting a swarm of street children who tear at his toga, steal his purse, and disappear into the maze of alleyways before he can even regain his footing. Violence is casual, swift, and utterly without consequence for those quick enough to escape into the crowd. Your stomach growls with a hunger that goes beyond simple appetite. It's the gnawing ache of chronic malnutrition that affects nearly everyone in your social class. The bread that forms the staple of your diet is often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The wine is watered down and frequently sour, the olive oil rancid, and the garum oil, the fermented fish sauce that flavors most Roman dishes, is a breeding ground for bacteria that would hospitalize a modern person within hours. But hunger is the least of your worries as you prepare to face the day. In your purse you have exactly 12 sestertii, barely enough to buy food for 2 days if you eat nothing but the cheapest bread and porridge. Rent for your miserable room costs 20 sestertii per month, and it's already 3 days overdue. Your landlord, Lucius Caesius Tertius, is known throughout the neighborhood for his violent collection methods. Men who can't pay their rent have been found floating in the harbor with their throats cut, and the authorities don't bother to investigate the deaths of poor freedmen. To earn money, you must venture into the streets and compete with dozens of other desperate men for whatever work might be available. Loading ships at the harbor, carrying water jugs, cleaning latrines, or hauling construction materials. Each of these jobs carries its own mortal dangers. The harbor is controlled by gangs who demand protection money and aren't hesitant to throw non-compliant workers into the bay. Construction work involves lifting massive stone blocks without modern safety equipment, resulting in regular crushings and falls. Even cleaning latrines exposes you to diseases that killed more Romans than wars and natural disasters combined. As you dress in your single tunic, a rough woolen garment that hasn't been properly cleaned in months and reeks of sweat, smoke, and worse, you realize that every choice you make today could be your last. Step on the wrong person's shadow, and you might be accused of practicing magic and face crucifixion. Make eye contact with the wrong nobleman's wife, and you could be beaten to death by her bodyguards. Fail to show proper respect to a citizen of higher status, and you might find yourself back in chains, sold into slavery to pay for your insolence. The sun is rising over Pompeii, painting the city's white walls with golden light and casting long shadows across streets that will soon fill with a million ways to die. You take a deep breath of the fetid air, feel the lice crawling across your scalp, and step toward the door. In a modern world, you might survive a day in the wilderness, handle a natural disaster, or even endure extreme poverty with social safety nets to catch you. But here in the most advanced civilization of the ancient world, you're about to discover that every moment of every day is a battle for survival that most modern people would lose within hours. Welcome to Pompeii, where the greatest danger isn't the volcano sleeping peacefully in the distance, but simply trying to stay alive long enough to see another sunrise. Your first task is simply getting dressed without dying. A challenge that would stump most modern people within minutes. The single tunic you own is made of rough, undyed wool that feels like sandpaper against skin accustomed to soft cotton and synthetic blends. Every movement creates painful chafing that will only worsen throughout the day. Roman clothing has no elastic, no zippers, no buttons, just bronze pins and knots that if tied incorrectly will cause your garment to fall off in public, a humiliation that could result in beating or worse. You fumble with the leather belt that serves as both clothing support and your only security system. Attached to it is a small pouch containing your meager coins, a rusty iron knife that's more danger to yourself than any attacker, and a wooden token proving your free status. Lose this, and you could be enslaved by any citizen who claims you as their runaway property. The belt must be tight enough to prevent theft, but not so tight that it restricts the blood flow that's already compromised by chronic malnutrition and intestinal parasites. Your feet, soft from a lifetime of shoes and paved surfaces, must now navigate the world in nothing but thin leather sandals that provide no protection from the sharp stones, broken pottery, and metal fragments that litter every surface. Within minutes of walking, you'll develop blisters that will become infected in the filthy environment, leading to the kind of foot rot that killed more Roman soldiers than enemy swords. As you stumble down the narrow wooden stairs from your room, each step threatens to send you plummeting to your death. The staircase is barely 2 feet wide, with no railings and steps worn smooth by thousands of feet, slick with grease and moisture. Roman buildings regularly collapse, killing dozens at a time, and your particular insula shows all the warning signs. Cracks in the walls, a slight lean to the left, and the ominous creaking that keeps residents awake at night. You emerge into the street to find that the morning calm you might expect simply doesn't exist in Pompeii. By the time the sun clears the horizon, the city is already a chaos of survival that would overwhelm any modern nervous system within minutes. The noise alone would be unbearable, dozens of different languages and dialects being shouted simultaneously as merchants hawk their wares, slaves cry out under the whip, children scream, animals bray, and the constant hammering of construction creates a cacophony that never stops. Your first stop must be the public fountain 3 blocks away, where you'll fill a clay amphora with the water you need to survive the day. This simple task, which takes seconds in the modern world, becomes an hour-long ordeal fraught with mortal danger. The fountain is controlled by the neighborhood's water gang, a group of thugs who demand payment from anyone seeking to fill containers larger than a cup. Without their permission, they'll smash your amphora, and likely your skull along with it. You join the line of desperate people waiting for their turn at the fountain, each carrying their own vessels and weapons. The man in front of you is Sextus Attilius, a brick maker whose arms are covered in burn scars from his trade. His constant coughing sprays blood onto everyone nearby, clear signs of the lung disease that kills most men in his profession before age 30. Behind you stands Claudia Metella, a washerwoman whose hands are eaten away by the harsh lye and chemicals she uses daily, her fingers resembling raw meat more than human appendages. The conversation around you reveals the daily reality of Roman life that no history book adequately conveys. Sextus mentions that 3 men from his workshop died this week, one crushed by falling bricks, one succumbed to fever, and one simply disappeared, likely murdered for the tools he carried. Claudia discusses the rape and murder of a young girl in the next neighborhood, an event so common that it barely registers as noteworthy conversation. When your turn finally arrives, you discover that drawing water from a Roman fountain requires skills you don't possess. The bronze spout is positioned at chest height, and you must balance your heavy amphora while manipulating a handle system that requires significant strength and coordination. Drop the vessel, and you've lost a day's wages to buy a replacement. Spill the water, and you'll have to start the dangerous process over again. The water itself would horrify any modern person, cloudy with sediment, tasting of metal and minerals, and carrying the distinctive flavor of the lead pipes through which it traveled. Romans had no understanding of waterborne diseases, so the same aqueduct system that supplies drinking water also carries away sewage, industrial waste, and runoff from cemeteries. Every gulp introduces new pathogens into your system, contributing to the chronic diarrhea that affects nearly every resident and kills thousands annually through dehydration. As you struggle with the amphora, now weighing nearly 40 pounds when full, You must navigate back through streets that have become exponentially more dangerous in just the past hour. The morning rush has begun, and Pompeii's narrow thoroughfares become death traps of competing traffic. Ox carts loaded with goods barrel through at full speed, their drivers showing no concern for pedestrians. A moment's inattention means being trampled under iron-shod wheels or massive hooves. The stepping stones that seemed quaint in tourism documentaries become a nightmare obstacle course when you're carrying a heavy, unwieldy container. Each stone is slippery with algae, animal waste, and the omnipresent slime that coats every surface in the city. A single misstep sends you tumbling into the sewage-filled street, soaking your only set of clothes in a mixture that guarantees infection of every cut and scratch on your body. But the physical dangers pale in comparison to the social minefield you must navigate with every interaction. As you struggle with your amphora, a well-dressed citizen approaches Marcus Holconius Seller, a wealthy wine merchant whose family owns several shops in the Forum. In the modern world, you might expect help or at least indifference from a stranger. In Roman Pompeii, this encounter could easily end with your death. Roman social hierarchy is not merely a class system, it's a matter of life and death enforced through immediate violence. As a freedman, you must show absolute deference to any full citizen, which means stepping immediately into the filthy gutter when they approach, averting your eyes and remaining silent unless directly addressed. Failure to show proper respect can result in a beating that leaves you permanently disabled, or worse, accusations of insolence that strip away your free status and return you to slavery. Marcus eyes your struggle with obvious disdain, not because he's particularly cruel, but because Roman culture views poverty and physical weakness as moral failings deserving of contempt. Your difficulty with the amphora marks you as someone worthy of exploitation or elimination. He barks an order for you to move faster, and when you stumble under the weight, his bodyguards, two Germanic slaves, built like human mountains, step forward with hands on their weapons. This is your first real test of survival in Pompeii. How to navigate a social interaction where showing weakness invites violence, but appearing too capable might be interpreted as uppity behavior from someone of your low status. Every word, gesture, and facial expression must thread an impossible needle between civility and competence, deference and dignity. Modern people, accustomed to egalitarian interactions and legal protections, fail this test within seconds, often with fatal consequences. The morning has barely begun, and you've already encountered enough mortal dangers to kill the average modern person several times over. Yet for the residents of Pompeii, this isn't exceptional malice, it's just another normal morning in paradise. As you finally manage to balance the amphora and continue through Pompeii's streets, the full scope of this urban nightmare begins to reveal itself. What tourist guides and history books describe as a marvel of Roman engineering is actually a death trap designed by and for people whose life expectancy barely reached 30 years. Every aspect of the city's infrastructure, from its celebrated roads to its famous buildings, represents a constant threat to anyone without the specific survival skills developed over generations of brutal adaptation. The streets themselves are architectural marvels that would kill most modern pedestrians within hours. The famous Roman roads, paved with large polygonal stones, create a surface so uneven that walking requires constant attention to avoid ankle-breaking gaps and protruding edges. These stones, polished smooth by centuries of traffic, become lethally slippery when wet with the constant mixture of water, urine, vomit, and blood that flows through the city's gutters. The roads are cambered, deliberately sloped toward the center to facilitate drainage, but this engineering marvel means you're constantly walking on an angled surface that throws off modern balance and gait. The stepping stones that allow pedestrians to cross streets without wading through sewage are positioned for Roman feet and Roman stride patterns. Modern people, taller and with different walking mechanics, find themselves constantly off balance, forced to take awkward steps that strain unfamiliar muscles and create vulnerable moments when a simple push from the crowd behind could send you tumbling into the filth. Between these stones, the streets serve as Pompeii's sewer system, carrying a flowing mixture that would violate every modern health code imaginable. Human and animal waste mingles with industrial runoff from the Polonicas, where cloth is cleaned using urine and harsh chemicals. The tanners dump their toxic solutions directly into the street, creating acidic streams that eat through leather and burn exposed skin. Metal workers contribute lead-laden water that slowly poisons everyone who comes into contact with it, causing the neurological damage that contributed to the notorious instability of Roman society. The city's water system, celebrated as one of Rome's greatest achievements, is actually a sophisticated mechanism for distributing disease and death. The aqueducts that bring fresh water from mountain springs also serve as highways for waterborne pathogens, while the lead pipes that distribute this water throughout the city leach poison into every drop. The public fountains, positioned throughout the neighborhoods, become gathering points for every contagious disease known to the ancient world. But it's the buildings themselves that represent the greatest threat to survival. Roman construction methods, while impressive in their ambition, ignore every safety principle that modern building codes take for granted. The insulae and mutians multi-story apartment buildings that house the majority of Pompeii's population are death traps waiting to collapse. Built with a combination of stone foundations and upper floors of wood and mud brick, these structures regularly cave in without warning, crushing entire families while they sleep. The ground floors of these buildings house shops and workshops where the real dangers of Roman urban life become apparent. The bakeries, which seem quaint and rustic to modern eyes, are actually industrial operations that would horrify any modern safety inspector. The ovens burn at temperatures that regularly ignite entire buildings, while the grain storage areas breed rats and insects that carry plague and typhus. The millers who grind the grain develop lung diseases from inhaling flour dust mixed with stone particles from the grinding wheels, coughing up blood as their lungs slowly fill with an abrasive paste that suffocates them over months of agony. The metalworking shops fill the air with toxic fumes from lead, mercury, and other heavy metals that cause brain damage, kidney failure, and birth defects. Roman craftsmen have no understanding of ventilation or protective equipment, so they simply endure the poisoning as an inevitable part of their trade. The average blacksmith's lifespan is 25 years, and most die in convulsions as their nervous systems shut down from metal poisoning. The clothing shops where fullers clean and dye fabric represent perhaps the most toxic environments in the entire city. The cleaning process involves trampling cloth in vats filled with human urine, collected daily from public latrines and private homes. The ammonia burns exposed skin and destroys lung tissue, while the various dyes contain arsenic, mercury, and other compounds that kill workers through slow poisoning. The bright colors that make Roman clothing so distinctive come at the cost of human lives. Every purple toga represents months of a dyer's life expectancy. Even the seemingly safe residential areas hide deadly secrets. Roman homes are designed around the atrium system, with an open courtyard that collects rainwater in a central pool. This system, elegant in concept, creates perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes carrying malaria, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases that kill thousands annually. The standing water also serves as a reservoir for intestinal parasites and bacterial infections that cause the chronic dysentery that weakens immune systems throughout the population. The walls of Roman buildings are covered with lead-based paints and decorated with pigments containing arsenic, mercury, and other toxic substances. Simply living indoors exposes residents to constant low-level poisoning that causes the neurological symptoms, rage, paranoia, hallucinations that characterize so much of Roman social behavior. The wealthy, who can afford the most elaborate decorations, actually poison themselves more effectively than the poor, contributing to the instability and violence of the upper classes. The city's famous thermal baths, celebrated as centers of Roman social life, are actually giant petri dishes where every disease known to the ancient world mingles and mutates. The heated pools create perfect conditions for bacterial growth, while the shared facilities spread skin infections, eye diseases, and parasites among all social classes. The practice of communal bathing, nude and without any understanding of hygiene, ensures that every patron leaves with new infections to share with their families and neighbors. The amphitheater and other public spaces concentrate thousands of people in enclosed areas without adequate sanitation, creating the conditions for epidemic diseases to spread rapidly through the population. The gladiatorial games, violent spectacles that seem exotic to modern viewers, actually serve a practical purpose in Roman society. They provide a method for culling the population before disease and starvation can do the job more slowly. Even the city's celebrated art and architecture conceal deadly hazards. The beautiful frescoes that cover every wall contain lead and mercury that slowly poison anyone who spends time near them. The marble sculptures and decorative elements are secured with iron clamps and lead joints that expand and contract with temperature changes, regularly breaking free and crushing passers-by. The magnificent public buildings, constructed without modern engineering knowledge, develop structural weaknesses that cause regular collapses during earthquakes, religious festivals, or simply under their own weight. As you navigate this urban hellscape, carrying your precious amphora of contaminated water through streets that serve as open sewers, you begin to understand why the average Roman lifespan was so short. It wasn't just disease or violence or accident, it was the cumulative effect of living in an environment where every breath, every step, every surface represented a threat to human health and safety. The city that represents the pinnacle of ancient civilization is actually a sophisticated machine for killing its inhabitants through 1,000 different methods, each more creative than the last. As you struggle through the morning chaos with your water amphora, small signs begin to accumulate that this particular day in Pompeii carries dangers beyond the usual urban death trap. These aren't the dramatic omens that Romans claim to see before great disasters, burning comets or two-headed calves, but the subtle indicators that experienced survivors learn to recognize as warnings that today's risks are higher than normal. The first sign comes from the animals. As you pass the livestock market near the Stabian Gate, you notice the oxen are unusually agitated, pulling against their restraints and lowing with a nervous energy that their handlers dismiss as simple stubbornness. The merchants trying to sell these beasts are offering prices far below normal, desperate to move animals that won't eat and can't be calmed. In the modern world, we might recognize this as seismic sensitivity, but to Romans it's simply bad livestock having a bad day. More telling is the behavior of the street dogs that serve as Pompeii's unofficial sanitation system, cleaning up the constant stream of food scraps and human waste. These animals, normally aggressive competitors for every morsel, are instead gathered in unusual clusters, whimpering and reluctant to enter certain buildings. You watch one mangy cub approach the entrance to a popular tavern, then back away with its tail between its legs, despite the smell of roasting meat that should drive any starving animal wild with hunger. The human population shows equally subtle signs of distress, though most Romans are too focused on immediate survival to notice patterns. The usual morning arguments between shopkeepers and customers carry an edge of hysteria that goes beyond normal commercial disputes. Lucius Versonius, the baker whose shop sits at the corner of Via dell'Abbondanza, has been screaming at his slaves with unusual viciousness, beating them for infractions that would normally merit only verbal abuse. His bread, usually acceptable by Roman standards, tastes more bitter than usual, might a sign that stress is affecting his judgment in mixing the dough. At the public fountain, the morning gossip carries darker undertones than normal. Gaius Epidius, a freedman who works as a scribe, mentions that 3 different citizens visited his services yesterday to update their wills balls, an unusual number for a man who normally handles such business perhaps once per month. Marcus Crassus Frugi, a prominent citizen known for his superstitious nature, has been seen making excessive offerings at the Temple of Venus, dropping coins into the sacred fire with the desperation of a man trying to buy divine protection. The children, always sensitive to adult anxiety, are more fractious than usual. Street fights break out with greater frequency, and the games they play have taken on violent themes that disturb even their parents. A group of boys near the amphitheater are playing gladiator with real knives stolen from their father's workshops, resulting in injuries that would normally send them running home but instead seem to encourage more reckless behavior. Even the weather seems subtly wrong, though in ways that Romans can't articulate. The morning breeze carries scents that don't belong, not just the usual mixture of sewage, smoke and cooking food, but something else, something that makes people unconsciously cover their noses and hurry past certain areas. The air itself feels heavier, creating a pressure that gives sensitive individuals headaches and makes everyone slightly more irritable than usual. The city's famous graffiti, normally focused on politics, love affairs and crude humor, has taken a darker turn. Fresh inscriptions on walls speak of nightmares and fears that their authors can't explain. The gods are angry appears scratched into the wall of the basilica, while someone has written "Death walks the streets" near the forum. These aren't the dramatic proclamations of prophets, but the nervous scribblings of ordinary people trying to express anxieties they can't understand. In the workshops and businesses, subtle signs of instability multiply. The potter Decimus Voltius mentions that his clay has been cracking more than usual during firing, forcing him to remake pieces multiple times before achieving acceptable results. The metal workers complain that their bronze is flowing poorly, creating flawed castings that require constant reworking. These production problems create economic stress that ripples through the community, making everyone slightly more desperate and dangerous. The wealthy show their own signs of unease, though they express it through different behaviors. Several prominent families have suddenly decided to visit their country estates, leaving their urban properties in the hands of slaves and freedmen. While Romans regularly travel for business or pleasure, the simultaneous departure of multiple wealthy households suggests something beyond coincidence. Those who remain are spending money with unusual extravagance, as if trying to enjoy their wealth before something makes it impossible. Religious observances have intensified in ways that go beyond normal Roman piety. The temples report increased attendance at daily sacrifices, with citizens offering more valuable gifts than their economic situations would normally warrant. The priests themselves seem nervous, interpreting every minor irregularity in the sacred flames or animal entrails as signs of divine displeasure. The usual confidence of Roman religious practice has been replaced by a desperate urgency that makes even the most routine ceremonies feel like pleas for salvation. The city's entertainment venues reflect the general unease. The gladiatorial schools report increased violence during training sessions, with fighters taking risks they would normally avoid. The theatrical performances scheduled for the coming weeks have been modified to remove themes of death and disaster, as audiences have begun reacting poorly to dramatic depictions of tragedy. Even the prostitutes in the Lupanaria mention that their clients are more aggressive and less generous, as if trying to cram a lifetime of pleasure into whatever time remains. Physical symptoms affect the population in ways that Roman medicine can't explain. Healers report increased cases of insomnia, digestive problems, and nervous conditions that don't respond to traditional treatments. The public baths see more arguments and fights, as people's normal social controls weaken under stress they can't identify. Children cry more, adults drink more, and everyone seems to be waiting for something terrible that they can't name. As you navigate through this subtly transformed city, your modern sensibilities might recognize these signs as indicators of collective psychological stress, perhaps triggered by seismic activity too minor for conscious detection. But as Gaius Brutidius, struggling to survive another day in ancient Pompeii, you simply feel that something is wrong without being able to articulate what it might be. The usual dangers seem more threatening, the normal hardships more unbearable, and the constant struggle for survival somehow more urgent. You adjust your grip on the amphora and continue toward your next challenge, unaware that these subtle warning signs are preparing the city for changes that will make today's survival tests seem trivial by comparison. Your path through the city brings you into contact with the intricate web of human relationships that make survival in Pompeii, dependent not just on individual skill, but on navigating a complex social ecosystem where everyone's fate interconnects in deadly ways. Each person you encounter represents a different survival strategy, a different set of risks, and a different way that Roman society can crush those who make even minor mistakes. Near the Forum Triangulare you encounter Publius Vedius Syracus, a successful wine merchant whose prosperity masks the precarious nature of even wealthy Roman lives. Vedius owns 3 shops, employs dozens of slaves, and lives in a domus decorated with expensive frescoes, yet his survival depends entirely on maintaining relationships with people who could destroy him at any moment. His wine comes from vineyards owned by senators who could revoke his trading rights on a whim. His ships are protected by naval commanders who demand increasingly expensive bribes. His slaves, if they chose to rebel or simply run away, could bankrupt him within days. You watch Vedius conduct business with Gaius Cuspius Pansa, a political candidate whose election campaign depends on Vedius's financial support. Their negotiation, conducted in the coded language of Roman patronage, reveals how even successful Romans live in constant fear. Pansa needs money to buy votes and sponsor gladiatorial games, but if he loses the election he'll be unable to protect Vedius from his competitors' lawsuits and sabotage. If Vedius refuses support, Pansa's rivals will destroy the merchant's business. Both men smile and embrace, but their eyes hold the desperation of people trapped in a system where today's ally becomes tomorrow's executioner. Nearby you observe Claudia Paloris, a former slave who now operates a small bakery that barely keeps her family fed. Her survival strategy is entirely different but equally precarious. She must produce enough bread to satisfy her customers while using flour that's often contaminated with ergot fungus, sand and mouse droppings. One batch of bad bread could kill her patrons and result in her being beaten to death by their families. Too little bread means hungry customers who might riot and destroy her shop. Too much means waste she can't afford. Claudia's husband, Marcus Paloris, works as a gladiator trainer at the local ludus, teaching men to kill each other for entertainment. His survival depends on producing fighters who are skilled enough to please the crowd but not so skilled that they might overpower their guards and escape. He must balance the nutritional needs of athletes with the economic reality that feeding gladiators costs more than most Romans earn in a month. Every day he sends men into the arena knowing that their deaths will reflect on his reputation as a trainer. Their children represent the next generation's struggle for survival in ways that would horrify modern parents. 12-year-old Gaius Pylorus works in his mother's bakery, handling ovens that regularly maim or kill adult bakers. His sister Claudia, only 10, already shows signs of the respiratory disease that kills most people in flour-heavy environments before age 30. The family can't afford to keep the children out of dangerous work, but can't afford to lose them to industrial accidents that claim dozens of child workers every month. In the metalworking district, you encounter Sextus Pomponius Felix, a freedman who has built a modest fortune manufacturing bronze vessels and surgical instruments. His workshop employs 15 people, including his own sons, in work that exposes them daily to lead poisoning, burns, and toxic fumes. Felix has survived longer than most in his trade by developing techniques for managing poisoning. He drinks wine mixed with crushed pearls, believing it counteracts lead absorption, and forces his workers to eat raw garlic to purify their blood. Felix's survival strategy involves managing multiple supply chains that could collapse at any moment. His bronze comes from mines in Hispania where slave rebellions regularly disrupt production. His fuel comes from forests that are rapidly being depleted to feed Rome's industrial appetite. His skilled workers are constantly being poached by competitors or dying from occupational diseases. Every aspect of his business depends on relationships with people who view him as either a resource to exploit or a competitor to eliminate. The most precarious survival story belongs to Julia Sabina, a widow attempting to maintain her deceased husband's textile business while navigating Roman laws that give women virtually no legal rights. She cannot own property in her own name, cannot make contracts without a male guardian's approval, and cannot appear in court to defend herself against the lawsuits that multiply around any successful business. Her survival depends entirely on her adult son Marcus Sabina, whose gambling debts and violent temper threaten to destroy everything she's worked to preserve. Julia's workshop employs mostly women and children who dye fabrics using processes that would violate every modern safety regulation. The workers' hands are permanently stained with dyes containing arsenic and mercury. Their lungs are scarred from inhaling toxic vapors. Their life expectancy rarely exceeds 25 years. Yet these jobs represent the only opportunity for economic independence available to women in Pompeii's rigid social structure. Each of these individuals has developed elaborate strategies for surviving in a system designed to eliminate the weak, the unlucky, and the politically inconvenient. They form temporary alliances, marriage contracts, business partnerships, and patronage relationships that provide mutual protection against the countless threats facing every Roman citizen. Yet these same relationships create new vulnerabilities. Every ally is also a potential betrayer. Every partnership is also a target for enemies. Every success attracts new dangers. As you observe their interactions, you realize that surviving in Pompeii requires not just physical endurance and practical skills, but a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics that takes Romans decades to master. Modern people, accustomed to legal protections and social safety nets, would find themselves completely unable to navigate these relationships successfully, leading to social isolation, economic ruin, and often violent death within days of making their first cultural mistake. As the morning progresses into the dangerous territory of midday, the subtle warning signs you noticed earlier begin to coalesce into patterns. that even the most survival-focused Romans can no longer ignore completely. The city's rhythm, normally predictably chaotic, has developed irregular beats that create a growing sense of unease among those experienced enough to recognize when Pompeii's usual dangers are being amplified by something beyond the ordinary. The first clear indication that today is different comes from the city's most reliable early warning system, its criminal population. The pickpockets, muggers, and street gangs who normally prowl the busy intersections have begun retreating to their hideouts earlier than usual. Quintus Decidius, a notorious thief who controls the area around the amphitheatre, has been seen moving his operation away from the city centre, telling his associates that the streets feel wrong today. When criminals start avoiding their most profitable hunting grounds, experienced Romans know to pay attention. At the slave market near the Marine Gate, prices have begun fluctuating wildly as both buyers and sellers seem driven by urgencies they can't articulate. Marcus Holconius Rufus, a dealer who has operated in the same location for 15 years, suddenly offers to sell his entire inventory at prices 30% below market value. When questioned, he simply states that he needs to conclude business quickly today. His slaves, normally resigned to their fate, seem more agitated than usual, with several attempting to escape, despite knowing that recapture means crucifixion. The city's animals provide the clearest indication that something fundamental has shifted. The horses used for transportation refuse to enter certain streets, forcing their handlers to take circuitous routes that disrupt normal traffic patterns. Dogs that normally compete viciously for scraps instead huddle together in nervous packs, whimpering at sounds only they can hear. Even the rats, usually bold scavengers that ignore human activity, have begun emerging from their hiding places in unusual numbers, creating an infestation that would normally take weeks to develop. In the Forum, political discussions have taken on an edge of hysteria that goes beyond normal Roman partisan passion. Gaius Cuspius Pansa, the candidate you observed earlier, has been seen making increasingly desperate promises to potential voters, offering bribes and privileges that would normally be saved for the final days before an election. His rival, Marcus Holconius Priscus, has responded by hiring additional bodyguards and spreading rumors that supernatural forces are working against his campaign. The city's religious life shows the most dramatic escalation of tension. At the Temple of Venus, the patron goddess of Pompeii, priests report that the sacred flames have been flickering unpredictably, requiring constant attention to keep them burning. The temple's collection boxes, normally filled gradually throughout the day, are overflowing by noon as citizens make offerings with the desperation of people trying to purchase divine protection against unspecified threats. More telling is the behavior of the priests themselves. Marcus Holconius Sella, the temple's chief priest and one of Pompeii's most respected citizens, has been seen consulting the sacred chickens multiple times, a practice normally reserved for major religious festivals or military campaigns. The chickens, used for divination by observing their eating patterns, have refused to eat at all, a sign that Roman religious tradition interprets as a warning of imminent disaster. The city's commercial life reflects the growing unease in ways that threaten the economic stability that keeps Pompeii functioning. At the Macellum, the covered market where most citizens buy their daily food, vendors are either raising prices dramatically or offering desperate discounts depending on whether they're trying to maximize immediate profits or clear inventory quickly. Lucius Caesius Tertius, your landlord and a prominent merchant, has been seen liquidating stock at losses that would normally take months to accumulate. The most sophisticated Romans are beginning to take concrete protective actions. Several wealthy families have quietly sent their most valuable possessions to banking houses in Naples and Rome, claiming they need secure storage for routine business purposes. Ships in the harbour report unusual numbers of passengers booking passage to distant ports, paying premium prices for immediate departure. The city's moneylenders note increased demand for loans secured by property, suggesting that people are trying to convert fixed assets into portable wealth. Professional survival experts, gladiators, soldiers, and career criminals display behaviors that would alarm anyone trained to recognize danger signals. At the gladiatorial school, trainers report that fighters are practicing with unusual intensity, as if preparing for battles more serious than normal arena entertainment. Veterans of military campaigns have been seen checking weapons and armor they haven't touched in years, claiming they're simply maintaining equipment, but betraying nervousness that suggests preparation for immediate conflict. The city's infrastructure begins showing signs of stress that go beyond normal maintenance issues. The aqueduct system experiences irregular flow patterns that force public fountains to run dry intermittently. The sewage systems back up more frequently, creating health hazards that add to the general sense of urban decay. Even the famous Roman roads develop more potholes and loose stones, as if the very foundations of the city are becoming unstable. Most ominously, the social controls that normally keep Roman society functioning despite its inherent violence begin to weaken visibly. Street fights escalate more quickly and end more brutally. Domestic disputes spill into public spaces with greater frequency. Even routine business negotiations carry threats of violence that would normally be reserved for serious conflicts. The thin veneer of civilization that allows thousands of desperate people to coexist in close quarters shows increasing signs of strain. As you continue your struggle to survive this increasingly volatile day, you notice that your fellow Romans are beginning to acknowledge, in small ways, that something is wrong. Conversations carry undertones of farewell. Business dealings are concluded with unusual finality. People touch protective amulets more frequently and make the sign against evil when they think no one is watching. The city that woke up as a normal death trap is transforming into something far more dangerous, a place where even the survival strategies developed over generations of Roman urban life may prove inadequate. The transformation from subtle unease to undeniable crisis arrives not with dramatic fanfare, but through a cascade of seemingly unrelated events that suddenly coalesce into a perfect storm of urban catastrophe. What began as minor irritations and strange animal behavior has evolved into a systematic breakdown of every mechanism that normally keeps Pompeii's population from tearing itself apart in desperate competition for survival. The tipping point arrives at the 6th hour, what we would call noon, when 3 separate incidents occur simultaneously across the city, each one significant enough to disrupt normal life, but together creating a crisis that overwhelms every Roman survival strategy you might have learned to navigate. At the harbour, a grain ship from Egypt, one of the vessels that keeps Pompeii's population fed, catches fire while unloading its cargo. The flames spread with supernatural speed, consuming not just the ship, but the wooden dock structures and nearby warehouses filled with food supplies. Within minutes, a significant portion of the city's food reserves is reduced to ash and smoke. The fire isn't accidental. Witnesses report seeing the crew abandon ship just before the flames erupted, suggesting sabotage by someone who wanted to create exactly this kind of crisis. Simultaneously in the Forum, a riot erupts during what should have been routine political campaigning. Supporters of the 2 major candidates, Gaius Cuspius Pansa and Marcus Holconius Priscus, begin fighting over accusations that supernatural omens favor one candidate over the other. The conflict escalates when someone produces a deformed lamb, claiming it was born on Priscus's property as a sign of divine disfavor. Within moments, hundreds of citizens are engaged in violent street combat, using knives, clubs, and broken pottery as weapons. The third crisis strikes the city's water supply. The main aqueduct that feeds Pompeii's fountains and public baths suddenly runs red with what appears to be blood. Roman engineers will later discover that iron deposits in the mountain springs have been disturbed by minor seismic activity, but to the population witnessing crimson water flowing from their taps, this can only mean one thing. The gods have withdrawn their protection from the city. These three simultaneous disasters create a cascade effect that transforms every normal survival challenge into a potentially fatal crisis. The burning harbour eliminates the food security that allows most Romans to focus on other dangers. The political riot destroys the social order that normally channels violence into predictable patterns. The contaminated water supply strikes at the most basic requirement for human survival while simultaneously appearing to confirm every superstitious fear that has been building throughout the morning. Your own situation, precarious but manageable just hours earlier, suddenly becomes desperate in ways that illustrate how quickly Roman urban life can shift from difficult to impossible. The amphora of water you struggled to obtain this morning is now precious beyond calculation, not just because clean water has become scarce, but because the red-tinged alternative flowing from public fountains terrifies even the most practical Romans into refusing to drink it. The bread you planned to buy with your meager coins is no longer available at any price, as the grain stores feeding the city's bakeries have been consumed by flames. The few merchants who still have food supplies are either hoarding them against uncertain futures or demanding payment in gold rather than the bronze and silver coins that normally suffice for daily transactions. Your 12 sestertii, barely adequate for survival this morning, now represent perhaps a tenth of what you need to eat today. More immediately threatening, the social breakdown transforms every Roman citizen into a potential enemy. The political riot has divided the city into armed camps, with neighbors who shared morning greetings now viewing each other as threats based on which candidate they support. Your status as a freedman, normally just a disadvantage in business dealings, now makes you a target for anyone seeking to blame the crisis on outsiders, former slaves, or other vulnerable populations. The streets themselves become impossible to navigate safely as normal traffic patterns collapse under the weight of panic, violence, and breakdown of civic order. The stepping stones that allowed pedestrians to cross sewage-filled streets are now controlled by armed gangs demanding tribute from anyone seeking passage. The narrow alleys that provided shortcuts between major thoroughfares have become ambush sites where desperate people rob and murder anyone who appears to possess food, water, or weapons. Even the buildings that provided shelter now represent new threats as their owners, faced with economic catastrophe and social breakdown, become increasingly desperate to extract value from their properties. Your landlord, Lucius Caesius Tertius, appears at your door demanding not just the rent you already owe but additional payment for protection services against the chaos engulfing the city. His enforcers make it clear that refusal means immediate eviction into streets that have become war zones. The crisis reaches your personal breaking point when you realize that every survival strategy you might employ has been simultaneously compromised. You cannot buy food because it's unavailable. You cannot work because employers are either fleeing the city or hoarding their resources. You cannot seek protection from authorities because the civic government has collapsed into armed factions. You cannot hide in your room because your landlord now views you as a liability to be eliminated. The morning's subtle warning signs have crystallized into an undeniable reality. Pompeii has crossed the threshold from a dangerous but navigable urban environment into a collapsing civilization where normal survival rules no longer apply. The point of no return has been reached, and every decision you make from this moment forward will determine whether you live to see another sunrise or join the growing number of bodies accumulating in the city's streets. As smoke from the harbour fires drifts across the forum and the sound of violence echoes from every direction, you face the stark realization that surviving the rest of this day will require abandoning every cautious strategy you've employed so far and embracing the kind of desperate measures that transform ordinary people into the killers and victims that Roman civilization produces in abundance. The moment you recognize that Pompeii has crossed into full societal breakdown, your modern instincts immediately betray you in ways that would prove fatal within minutes. Your first impulse to seek help from authorities, call for emergency services, or find some form of organized disaster response reveals how completely unprepared you are for survival in a world where civilization's collapse means every person becomes both predator and prey simultaneously. There are no police to call, no emergency services to summon, no government agencies coordinated to handle civil unrest. Roman civic authority consists of a handful of elected magistrates whose power depends entirely on their ability to command personal loyalty from armed supporters. When those supporters are busy fighting each other in the forum, civil authority simply ceases to exist. The watchmen who normally patrol the streets at night have either joined one of the rioting factions or barricaded themselves in their homes to protect their own families. Your second instinct to gather information and assess the situation rationally proves equally dangerous in a world where appearing vulnerable or indecisive invites immediate attack. While you stand in your doorway trying to understand what's happening, Lucius Caesius Tertius and his enforcers interpret your hesitation as weakness. Before you can formulate a plan, they've already decided your fate based on their assessment that you represent more liability than value in the current crisis. You owe rent, and now you owe protection fees, Tertius declares, his voice carrying the casual menace of a man who has made similar demands hundreds of times before. Pay both now or we clear you out permanently. His enforcers, two Germanic slaves whose freedom depends on their willingness to commit violence on command, step forward with the practiced coordination of men who have beaten debtors to death as routine business. Your modern instinct to negotiate, to explain your financial situation, or to appeal to reason encounters the brutal reality of Roman crisis management. Tertius doesn't want explanations. He wants immediate compliance or elimination of a problem. Every second you spend trying to formulate reasonable responses is time his enforcers use to position themselves for maximum efficiency in beating you unconscious. The violence, when it begins, unfolds with a speed and brutality that would shock anyone accustomed to modern conflict. Roman street fighting isn't the prolonged dramatic combat portrayed in movies. It's swift, efficient, and designed to incapacitate or kill opponents before they can mount effective resistance. The Germanic slaves don't waste time with threats or posturing. They simply begin hitting you with wooden clubs, weighted with lead, aiming for joints and organs that will cause maximum damage with minimum effort. Your soft modern body, accustomed to climate control, processed food, and medical care, responds to violence in ways that would horrify ancient Romans accustomed to regular brutality. The first blow, aimed at your left shoulder, doesn't just cause pain, it creates a shock response that temporarily paralyzes your entire nervous system. The second strike, targeting your ribs, produces sounds that make even the enforcers pause momentarily, surprised by how easily modern bone structure yields to ancient violence. But the beating stops not from mercy, but from practical Roman calculation. Tertius realizes that killing you immediately eliminates any possibility of recovering the money you owe, while leaving you alive but injured creates a warning example for other tenants. You have until sunset to find what you owe, he announces, or we finish this conversation permanently. Left bleeding and barely conscious in your doorway, you face the immediate reality that survival now requires abandoning every social norm and moral constraint that makes modern civilization possible. The injuries you've sustained would normally require immediate medical attention. You likely have internal bleeding, certainly have broken ribs, and possibly have sustained concussion from blows to your head. In the modern world, you would call an ambulance and expect professional treatment. In Roman Pompeii, you must either treat yourself with primitive remedies or die from complications. The medical knowledge available consists entirely of folk remedies and surgical techniques that kill more patients than they save. The nearest thing to a hospital is a gladiator medical facility designed to patch up fighters quickly enough to return them to combat, not to provide comprehensive care for serious injuries. The physicians available either demand payment you don't possess or practice medicine that consists primarily of bloodletting, primitive surgery, and herbal treatments that are often more toxic than the conditions they're supposed to cure. More immediately threatening, your visible injuries mark you as prey for every predator in a city where social breakdown has eliminated normal restraints on violence. Other desperate Romans, seeing that you've already been beaten and are unable to defend yourself effectively, recognize an opportunity to acquire whatever resources you might possess without risking confrontation with someone capable of resistance. The first attempt comes within minutes, as a group of street children, normally just pickpockets and beggars, surround you with knives and broken pottery. Led by a boy no older than 12 who was clearly killed before, they demand your clothes, your sandals, and any coins you might have hidden. When you try to explain that you've already been robbed, their leader responds by cutting a shallow gash across your forearm to demonstrate that negotiations are not an option. The speed with which ordinary Romans adapt to crisis conditions reveals survival skills developed over generations of urban violence. These children don't hesitate, don't show mercy, and don't waste time with unnecessary brutality. They simply take what they want and move on to their next victim. Their efficiency in stripping you of everything valuable happens so quickly that you barely comprehend what's occurring before finding yourself naked, bleeding, and alone in streets that have become hunting grounds for anyone strong enough to take what they want from those too weak to resist. As you struggle to remain conscious while watching smoke rise from the harbor and listening to the sounds of systematic violence echoing from every direction, you realize that the morning's challenges, finding water, avoiding disease, navigating social hierarchies, now seem almost quaint compared to the fundamental struggle simply to remain alive until darkness falls. Naked, bleeding, and stripped of everything you owned, you face the brutal realization that surviving the next few hours requires transforming yourself from a civilized person into something that can function in a world where human life has less value than a broken clay pot. Your modern moral framework, built on concepts like fairness, legal protection, and social cooperation, becomes not just useless but actively dangerous in an environment where survival depends on predatory calculation and immediate violence. Your first challenge is finding shelter before your injuries and exposure kill you outright. Roman buildings, constructed without modern safety considerations, offer hiding places that are themselves potentially fatal. The collapsed section of an insular wall creates a small cave-like space, but the unstable masonry could crush you if disturbed. A drainage pipe large enough to crawl into provides concealment from human predators but exposes you to the toxic waste that flows constantly through Pompeii's primitive sewer system. You choose the drainage pipe, despite knowing that the contaminated water will infect your open wounds with diseases that would kill you slowly over weeks of agony. The immediate threat of human violence outweighs long-term health concerns, a calculation that Romans make daily, but that would paralyze most modern decision-making processes with ethical complications and risk assessment protocols. Inside the fetid tunnel, surrounded by human waste and industrial runoff, you begin the process of treating injuries that would require emergency surgery in the modern world. Roman first aid consists of techniques passed down through generations of people who routinely survived trauma that would be fatal without modern medical intervention. You pack the deeper cuts with mud mixed with your own urine, a treatment that sounds insane to modern sensibilities but actually provides some antiseptic benefit through the ammonia content and helps stop bleeding through coagulation. The broken ribs present a more serious challenge. Roman medicine offers no equivalent to modern chest X-rays or internal imaging, so you must assess internal damage through pain levels and breathing patterns. The sharp stabbing sensation when you inhale suggests that bone fragments might be threatening vital organs, but there's no way to determine the extent of internal injury without techniques that won't be invented for centuries. Your solution involves a survival strategy that would horrify modern medical ethics, but represents standard Roman self-treatment for combat injuries. You bind your torso tightly with strips torn from discarded cloth found in the tunnel, creating external pressure that might prevent bone fragments from shifting, while simultaneously restricting breathing enough to reduce the risk of lung puncture. The technique could save your life or kill you through respiratory failure, but Roman survival requires accepting risks that modern safety protocols would never permit. The search for food and water becomes an exercise in scavenging that transforms you into one of the urban predators you were avoiding just hours earlier. The contaminated public fountains offer water that's probably safer than the sewage surrounding you, but reaching them requires crossing open ground where you'll be visible to the armed gangs that now control most street intersections. Your strategy involves timing movements with the chaos of ongoing riots and fires, using smoke and confusion as concealment while groups of Romans fight each other for resources and territory. This requires developing the predatory awareness that allows Roman survivors to identify opportunities while avoiding becoming opportunities themselves. You must learn to recognize which groups are distracted enough to allow safe passage, which individuals appear weak enough to rob without significant risk, and which situations offer resources worth the danger of acquisition. The first test comes when you spot a dead body in an alley known to a middle-aged Roman who appears to have been killed recently for his possessions. His clothing, while blood-stained, would provide protection from exposure and some social camouflage among other survivors. But claiming these resources requires speed, violence, and the willingness to fight other scavengers who have made the same calculation. 3 street children arrive simultaneously, armed with knives and clearly experienced in stripping corpses efficiently. Your modern instincts suggest negotiation or sharing, but Roman survival logic demands either immediate retreat or aggressive dominance. Hesitation marks you as prey. Cooperation suggests weakness that invites exploitation. You must either take what you need through violence or abandon the resources entirely. You choose violence with a desperation that surprises you. Using a broken piece of masonry as a weapon, you attack the largest child with the kind of brutal efficiency that Romans developed through constant exposure to life or death situations. The blow crushes his skull with a sound that would haunt civilized nightmares but barely registers in your survival-focused consciousness. The other children flee immediately, recognizing someone who has crossed the threshold from victim to predator. Stripping the corpse provides clothing, sandals, and a small knife, but more importantly, it completes your psychological transformation from civilized person to Roman survivor. The moral constraints that would normally prevent you from robbing the dead have been eliminated by the simple reality that maintaining ethical standards means death, while abandoning them offers the possibility of continued existence. Your next survival priority involves finding allies who might provide mutual protection without immediately betraying or murdering you for whatever resources you've acquired. Roman social bonds, even in crisis situations, operate on principles of immediate utility and constant threat assessment. Potential allies evaluate your value based on your ability to contribute to their survival while simultaneously planning contingencies for eliminating you if circumstances change. The process requires presenting yourself as useful enough to keep alive but not so valuable that others might kill you to acquire your resources directly. This balance point shifts constantly as conditions change, requiring constant recalibration of social strategies that most modern people would find psychologically impossible to maintain. Your newfound ruthlessness and acquired resources provide only momentary advantages before Pompeii's deteriorating situation introduces complications that make your previous struggles seem elementary. The city's breakdown has progressed beyond random violence into organized territorial warfare, where survival requires navigating between armed factions whose alliances shift hourly and whose methods become increasingly sophisticated and deadly. The first complication emerges when you attempt to find drinkable water at one of the few fountains still producing clear liquid. The area around the Fountain of Abundance has been claimed by a group calling themselves the Defenders of Traditional Rome, displaced shopkeepers and craftsmen who blame the crisis on foreign influences and freedmen like yourself. Their leader, Marcus Appidius Sabinus, a failed politician seeking to rebuild his career through violent populism, has organized them into a militia that systematically hunts anyone they classify as undesirable. Your appearance, the blood-stained clothing of a dead Roman, the obvious signs of recent violence, and the desperate look that marks all survivors, immediately identifies you as a target for their purification efforts. But before they can capture you, a competing group attacks their position. The sons of Vulcan Minus, escaped gladiators and slaves led by a Thracian fighter named Spartaculus Minor, have decided that the crisis offers an opportunity to settle scores with their former oppressors. The battle that erupts transforms the fountain area into a killing ground where both factions use weapons and tactics that demonstrate just how quickly Romans can escalate from civil disorder to military-style warfare. The defenders fight with the disciplined formations they learned during military service, using shields and short swords to create defensive positions. The sons of Vulcan employ gladiatorial techniques, individual combat skills designed for maximum lethality in confined spaces. You find yourself trapped between two forces whose conflict has nothing to do with your survival needs but whose violence threatens to kill you as collateral damage. Roman warfare makes no distinction between combatants and bystanders. Everyone in a combat zone is either an ally, an enemy, or acceptable casualties. Your modern instincts to declare neutrality or seek non-combatant status have no meaning in a culture where survival requires choosing sides immediately and demonstrating loyalty through participation in violence. The second major complication comes from an unexpected source: the city's infrastructure beginning to fail in ways that multiply every existing danger. The aqueduct system, damaged by the morning's mysterious contamination and ongoing seismic activity, starts experiencing complete failures that eliminate water supplies throughout entire neighborhoods. The sewage system, overwhelmed by increased usage from people afraid to venture outside, begins backing up into buildings and streets. creating health hazards that would kill more people than the ongoing violence. More ominously, fires started during the harbour incident and political riots begin spreading through Pompeii's closely packed buildings, with a speed that suggests either deliberate arson or supernatural intervention. Roman firefighting consists of bucket brigades and demolishing structures to create fire breaks, techniques that work for isolated fires, but prove completely inadequate when multiple blazes merge into a conflagration that threatens entire districts. The spreading flames force you to abandon your temporary shelter and venture into streets now controlled by various factions whose territorial boundaries shift with the advancing fire. Each group has developed different strategies for dealing with the crisis, and moving between their areas requires rapid adaptation to completely different survival rules. The traditionalists demand proof of Roman citizenship and evidence of loyalty to their cause. The gladiator faction requires demonstration of fighting skills and willingness to participate in raids against former masters. A third group, led by wealthy merchants, offers protection in exchange for labor that amounts to temporary slavery. Each faction's territory offers different resources and dangers, but none provides long-term safety for someone without permanent allegiance. Your attempt to navigate between these groups while seeking basic necessities creates an increasingly complex web of obligations and enemies. The water you obtain from traditionalist territory comes with the expectation that you'll participate in their next attack on foreign merchants. The food you acquire from the gladiator faction requires you to help plan raids on wealthy homes. The temporary shelter offered by the merchant coalition demands labor that exposes you to industrial hazards that could cause delayed death from poisoning or injury. Each transaction creates new complications as word of your activities spreads through networks of spies and informants that every faction maintains to monitor potential threats and opportunities. Your movements become predictable to enemies while your resources make you valuable enough to kidnap or rob. The survival skills you've developed prove inadequate for managing the political complexity of organized factions whose leaders think strategically about resource control and territorial expansion. The situation escalates beyond your ability to manage when representatives from all three factions simultaneously demand your exclusive loyalty. Marcus Appidius Sabinus threatens to execute you as a spy if you don't immediately join the traditionalist attack on the foreign quarter. Spartaculus Minor offers protection only if you help assassinate rival gladiator trainers who have allied with the merchants. The merchant coalition demands you provide intelligence about both other factions' military capabilities. Your modern instincts toward honesty and straightforward dealing become actively suicidal in negotiations where every faction expects deception and plans contingencies for betrayal. The diplomatic skills that might resolve conflicts in civilized society have no application in discussions where each party assumes the others will break any agreement as soon as it becomes advantageous. As flames spread closer to your position and the sound of organized warfare echoes from multiple directions, you realize that surviving the rest of this day requires choosing between lethal alternatives while accepting that every decision will create new enemies determined to kill you for reasons ranging from practical resource competition to ideological purification to simple entertainment. The pressure to choose between mutually exclusive loyalties forces you to make a decision that epitomizes the impossible nature of survival in collapsed Roman society. You must simultaneously betray all three factions while appearing to serve each one, a strategy that requires deception skills developed over lifetimes of Roman political intrigue and personal duplicity that no modern person possesses. Your solution involves a desperate gambit that exploits the one advantage modern people might have in ancient crisis situations: the ability to think beyond the immediate tribal loyalties that dominate Roman decision-making. While each faction focuses on destroying their immediate enemies, you recognize that all three groups share a common vulnerability to the spreading fires that threaten to eliminate their territorial bases entirely. You approach Marcus Epidius Sabinus with information about a water source controlled by the Gladiator faction, suggesting that capturing it would give the traditionalists a decisive advantage. Simultaneously, you inform Spartaculus Minor about weapons stored in merchant territory, implying that seizing them would ensure gladiator dominance. To the merchant coalition, you reveal the locations of both rival groups' leadership meetings, suggesting coordinated strikes could eliminate both threats simultaneously. Each faction believes you're providing exclusive intelligence that will ensure their victory, but your actual plan involves triggering a three-way battle that will eliminate or weaken all the organized groups while you escape during the resulting chaos. This strategy requires timing, precision, and psychological manipulation that would challenge experienced Roman politicians, let alone someone learning survival skills through desperate improvisation. The plan begins to unfold when the traditionalist attack on the Gladiator water source coincides with the Gladiator raid on merchant weapons supplies, just as merchant assassination teams move against both rival leaderships. The resulting confusion creates exactly the chaos you hoped for, but also introduces complications you didn't anticipate and can't control. The three-way battle triggers a cascade of unintended consequences that demonstrate how quickly Roman violence escalates beyond anyone's ability to predict or manage. Buildings catch fire from overturned oil lamps during fighting. Civilians flee into the streets, creating crowds that become targets for all three factions. The noise attracts additional groups from other parts of the city, transforming a localized conflict into a city-wide breakdown of any remaining social order. Your escape during the initial confusion succeeds, but your betrayal of all three factions creates a new level of danger. The survivors from each group independently decide that hunting you down has become a priority that transcends their other conflicts. Roman culture places enormous emphasis on personal honor and revenge, meaning that your deception transforms you from a temporary inconvenience into a permanent enemy whose elimination becomes a matter of pride for multiple groups. The pursuit that follows reveals how sophisticated Roman tracking and man-hunting techniques can become when motivated by personal vendetta rather than simple resource acquisition. Your pursuers don't just search randomly, they organize systematic sweeps that demonstrate military training and gladiatorial tactical knowledge. They interview other survivors to map your movements, analyze your behavior patterns to predict future actions, and coordinate between groups to eliminate escape routes. Your flight through the burning city requires navigating hazards that multiply exponentially as Pompeii's infrastructure completely collapses. Streets become impassable due to rubble from collapsed buildings, forcing detours through areas controlled by new factions that have emerged from the chaos. The air itself becomes toxic from smoke, making breathing difficult, while the heat from multiple fires creates temperature conditions that cause dehydration and heat exhaustion. Water becomes scarce enough that fights break out over puddles contaminated with sewage and ash. Food disappears entirely as the few remaining supplies are hoarded by organized groups or consumed by fires. Sleep becomes impossible due to constant danger, creating exhaustion that impairs judgment and reaction times when making mistakes means immediate death. The most dangerous complication comes from your own psychological deterioration under stresses that exceed human evolutionary adaptation. The constant violence, the betrayal of survival allies, the necessity of killing other people for resources. These experiences create mental changes that Romans accept as normal parts of adult life, but that would constitute severe trauma requiring professional treatment in modern society. You begin experiencing symptoms that would be recognized today as acute stress disorder, hallucinations, paranoid thinking, loss of impulse control, and emotional numbing that makes it easier to commit violence but harder to make rational survival decisions. These changes help you function in Roman crisis conditions but also increase the likelihood of making fatal mistakes through overconfidence or miscalculation. Your pursuers eventually corner you in the ruins of a collapsed temple, forcing a final confrontation that demonstrates how Roman personal combat differs from modern expectations of violence. There are no rules, no opportunities for surrender, no possibility of negotiation. The fight is simply a matter of who can inflict fatal injuries most efficiently, using whatever weapons and tactics provide the best chance of survival. The battle unfolds with the brutal speed characteristic of Roman violence, moments of preparation followed by seconds of decisive action that determine who lives and who dies. Your modern squeamishness about causing serious harm to other people proves nearly fatal when hesitation allows opponents to gain advantageous positions, but desperation and the survival instincts you've developed throughout this nightmarish day eventually overcome civilized restraints. When the violence ends, you're alive but fundamentally changed in ways that would make readjustment to civilized society psychologically impossible. The person who woke up this morning in Pompeii no longer exists, replaced by someone capable of the calculated brutality necessary for survival in a world where human life has no intrinsic value beyond its utility for immediate survival needs. As darkness begins to fall over Pompeii, what little remained of civilized society undergoes its final collapse into a nightmare that surpasses anything you could have imagined when this day began. The fires that started as isolated incidents have merged into a conflagration that consumes entire districts, while the factional warfare has devolved into a city-wide hunt where every survivor views every other survivor as either prey or predator, with no middle ground for neutrality or mercy. Your final test of survival begins when you realize that the ruins of the temple where you defeated your pursuers offer no long-term sanctuary. The building's remaining walls are structurally unsound, damaged by both the earlier earthquake tremors and the heat from approaching fires. More critically, the bodies of your enemies will attract other predators, both human scavengers seeking weapons and wild dogs that have begun feeding on the increasing number of corpses throughout the city. The decision to leave your temporary refuge forces you into the open during the most dangerous period of the Roman day, the hours after sunset when normal social activities cease, and the streets become hunting grounds for those who prefer darkness for their activities. In peaceful times, respectable Romans avoid venturing outside after dark due to crime rates that would shock modern urban dwellers. During the current crisis, nighttime Pompeii has become a hellscape where survival requires senses and skills that most humans never develop. Your movement through the darkened streets must account for multiple types of predators operating simultaneously. Armed gangs control major intersections, demanding tribute from anyone seeking passage while offering no guarantee of safe conduct even after payment. Individual killers stalk the shadows, targeting isolated survivors for robbery, rape, or simple entertainment. Wild animals, driven from their normal habitats by the fires and chaos, hunt through areas where they would never normally venture, adding an element of predation that even experienced Romans rarely encounter. The most immediate threat comes from a group you haven't encountered before, the city's slave population, who have collectively decided that the breakdown of social order offers an opportunity to settle scores with their masters and anyone else who represents the system that oppressed them. Led by Marcus Venerius Secundus, an educated Greek who served as a tutor before attempting escape and subsequent brutal punishment, they've organized into the most efficient killing force the crisis has produced. Unlike the other factions who fight primarily for resources or territory, the escaped slaves are motivated by pure revenge and the knowledge that capture means torture and death regardless of their current actions. This gives them a psychological advantage over opponents who still harbor hopes of surviving until normal society resumes. They fight with the desperate efficiency of people who have nothing to lose and everything to gain from maximizing the destruction they can cause. Your encounter with this group occurs when you attempt to reach one of the city gates, hoping to escape Pompeii entirely before the situation deteriorates further. The Vesuvius Gate, normally guarded by a handful of watchmen who could be bribed or avoided, is now controlled by a coordinated force that has transformed the exit into a killing ground where they can eliminate Romans attempting to flee with portable wealth. The battle that determines whether you live or die unfolds in complete darkness, using senses and combat techniques that require adaptation beyond normal human capabilities. Roman night fighting depends on hearing enemy movements, feeling vibrations through the ground, and developing spatial awareness that allows accurate weapon use without visual targeting. These skills take years to develop, but you must master them in minutes or die from your educational failures. The fight becomes a test of every survival skill you've acquired during this horrific day, combined with physical capabilities pushed beyond their normal limits by exhaustion, injury, and malnutrition. Your opponents are similarly degraded but possess advantages in numbers, familiarity with the terrain, and experience with coordinated violence that makes individual heroics suicidal. Your survival depends on exploiting the one factor working in your favor. The escaped slaves' unfamiliarity with their own success has made them overconfident in ways that create tactical vulnerabilities. They've begun celebrating prematurely, drinking wine looted from destroyed shops and becoming careless about maintaining defensive positions. Their leader, intoxicated by the unprecedented experience of having power over former masters, makes strategic decisions based on emotional satisfaction rather than practical effectiveness. You survive the encounter not through superior fighting ability, but by recognizing and exploiting these psychological weaknesses while your opponents are too drunk on revenge to maintain the discipline that gave them their initial advantages. The victory costs you injuries that would require immediate medical attention in any civilized setting, but provides access to the gate and the possibility of escape from a city that has become uninhabitable. But reaching the gate reveals the ultimate test. Beyond Pompeii's walls lies not safety, but a landscape transformed by the day's events into something equally hostile to human survival. The countryside shows signs of the same social breakdown affecting the city, with bands of refugees turned bandits controlling the roads and rural estates burning in the distance. The choice becomes whether to remain in familiar dangers or venture into unknown threats that might prove even more lethal. As you stand at the threshold between the known hell of Pompeii and the uncertain dangers of the outside world, bleeding from multiple wounds and exhausted beyond normal human endurance, you face the realization that surviving this day has been only the first test of staying alive in a world where civilization has proven to be nothing more than a temporary agreement that dissolves instantly under sufficient pressure. The ultimate test isn't whether you can escape Pompeii, but whether you can survive becoming the kind of person capable of living in the world that emerges when human society strips away its pretense of order and reveals the predatory reality beneath. Standing at the Vesuvius Gate with the burning city behind you and unknown darkness ahead, you make the final decision that defines your transformation from civilized person to Roman survivor. You choose to remain in Pompeii rather than venture into a countryside that might offer even fewer opportunities for survival. This choice, which would seem insane to modern thinking, reflects the brutal calculation that familiarity with specific dangers outweighs the risks of encountering unknown threats while weakened by injury and exhaustion. Your decision proves correct when dawn reveals the fate of those who chose escape. Bodies line the roads leading away from the city, refugees killed by bandits, wild animals, or simply exposure and dehydration. The countryside offers no infrastructure for supporting displaced populations, no resources for feeding the desperate, and no protection from the human predators who view fleeing Romans as opportunities for easy profit through robbery and murder. Within Pompeii's walls, the night has produced a new equilibrium of violence that offers marginally better survival prospects for those capable of adapting to its rules. The various factions have either destroyed each other or formed temporary alliances based on mutual exhaustion rather than shared ideology. The escaped slaves control the eastern districts, the surviving traditionalists hold the forum area, and scattered groups of merchants and craftsmen maintain defensive positions around their remaining resources. You find yourself accepted by none of these organized groups but tolerated by all as someone who is proven capable of survival without posing a direct threat to their interests. This liminal status, dangerous enough to avoid persecution but not valuable enough to eliminate, provides the narrow space within which continued existence becomes possible. Your resolution involves establishing yourself in one of the city's most dangerous but overlooked niches, the ruins of collapsed buildings where you can scavenge for resources while avoiding the territorial conflicts that consume organized groups. The collapsed insula near the amphitheater becomes your base, offering shelter that requires daily risk assessment as the unstable structure continues deteriorating, but providing concealment from human predators who prefer easier targets. Your survival strategy evolves into a routine that would horrify your former self but represents successful adaptation to Pompeii's new reality. Dawn begins with checking traps you've set for the rats that now constitute your primary protein source, followed by searching through rubble for anything valuable enough to trade for water or additional food. Midday involves scavenging expeditions into areas where factional conflicts have produced fresh corpses worth stripping for resources. The psychological changes required for this existence transform you into someone your former self wouldn't recognize. You develop the emotionally detached calculation that allows Romans to assess other humans purely in terms of threat levels and resource potential. Empathy becomes a luxury you can't afford, replaced by the predatory awareness that keeps you alive while slowly erasing the moral constraints that once defined your identity. Your success in adapting to these conditions attracts the attention of other survivors who recognize your techniques and begin copying your strategies. Within weeks, a loose community of scavengers develops around the ruins, forming temporary alliances for mutual protection while maintaining the constant vigilance necessary to prevent betrayal and murder by temporary allies. This community represents the bottom tier of Pompeii's new social order, people who have survived by abandoning every civilized constraint, but lack the organization or resources to challenge the established factions. You become one of its informal leaders not through charisma or planning, but simply by demonstrating consistent success in staying alive while helping others learn similar skills. The leadership role brings responsibilities that illustrate how Roman social organization emerges naturally from survival necessities rather than abstract political theories. You must mediate disputes between scavengers competing for the same resources, organize group defenses against raids by organized factions, and make decisions about admitting new members who might contribute to group survival or eliminate existing members who become liabilities. These responsibilities require developing skills in violence management, resource allocation, and human psychology that Romans learned through decades of exposure to urban survival challenges. Your success in adapting to these roles demonstrates that modern people can potentially survive in ancient conditions, but only by becoming fundamentally different people through psychological changes that amount to controlled mental breakdown. The final resolution of your story comes months later, when a semblance of normal Roman order begins re-establishing itself as outside authorities restore control over the city. Imperial troops arrive to suppress the various factions, while merchants from other cities bring resources needed to rebuild basic infrastructure. The crisis that transformed Pompeii into a war zone gradually subsides as normal Roman civilization reasserts itself. But your reintegration into civilized society proves impossible. The psychological adaptations that enabled survival during the crisis make you unsuitable for normal social interaction. You've developed responses to human contact that assume hostile intent, negotiation strategies based on implicit violence, and emotional numbness that prevents the social bonding necessary for civilian life. Your fate represents the typical outcome for Romans who survive extreme crisis situations: permanent psychological exile from the society they fought to preserve. You remain in Pompeii, but in the shadows and margins, one of the damaged survivors who remind everyone else how thin the veneer of civilization really is, and how quickly ordinary people can transform into something their former selves would fear and despise. As normal life resumes around you, citizens conducting business in the rebuilt forum or attending games in the repaired amphitheater occasionally glimpse you among the ruins and remember the days when their beautiful city became a killing ground where survival required abandoning everything that made life worth living. You survived a day in Pompeii, but the cost was becoming someone for whom survival was the only remaining value. The restoration of Roman order to Pompeii reveals the true scope of what the crisis destroyed: not just buildings and lives, but the fundamental social contracts that make urban civilization possible. As imperial troops patrol streets that recently ran with blood and merchants cautiously reopen shops in buildings still scarred by fire, the city attempts to resume normal function while pretending that the events of recent months were an aberration rather than a revelation of Roman society's underlying nature. The official casualty count recorded by military scribes for administrative purposes lists 847 confirmed deaths, a number that represents only the bodies recovered from accessible locations and identified by surviving relatives. The actual death toll remains unknowable, as hundreds of people simply disappeared during the chaos, their fates lost among the collapsed buildings, burned districts, and mass graves hastily dug by cleanup crews who prioritized disease prevention over individual dignity. More telling than the deaths are the survivors who can no longer function in restored civilian society. The imperial census, conducted 6 months after order was re-established, reveals that nearly a third of Pompeii's population has either fled permanently or developed psychological conditions that prevent normal social interaction. These damaged survivors cluster in the city's margins, abandoned buildings, collapsed structures, and areas too dangerous for regular habitation, forming a shadow population that serves as a constant reminder of civilization's fragility. Your own existence exemplifies this post-crisis reality. The ruins of the collapsed insula have become a permanent settlement for those who can no longer adapt to normal Roman social expectations. The community that formed around survival scavenging has evolved into a parallel society with its own rules, hierarchies, and methods for managing resources and conflicts. The psychological changes that enabled survival during the crisis prove irreversible under normal circumstances. Roman medicine recognizes various forms of mental disturbance but lacks any understanding of trauma treatment or psychological rehabilitation. The concept that people might recover from extreme experiences simply doesn't exist in a culture that views character as fixed by birth and divine favor rather than shaped by environmental conditions. Your daily routine illustrates how profoundly the crisis has altered basic human functioning. You wake each dawn in a state of hypervigilance that assesses every sound and movement for potential threats. The paranoid awareness that kept you alive during the violence now makes normal social interaction impossible, as you interpret casual conversations as potential deceptions and friendly gestures as possible attacks. The economic impact of the crisis extends far beyond immediate physical damage. Pompeii's commercial networks, built on trust relationships and credit arrangements that took generations to establish, have been shattered by the betrayals and violence that characterized the breakdown period. Merchants who survived the crisis find themselves unable to conduct business with former partners whose actions during the emergency violated fundamental expectations of loyalty and mutual support. The restoration process reveals how Roman responses to urban catastrophe prioritize order and appearance over addressing underlying causes or supporting individual recovery. Imperial administrators focus on rebuilding visible infrastructure, roads, public buildings, markets, while ignoring the social and psychological damage that makes effective use of these facilities impossible. New laws implemented by the restored government attempt to prevent future breakdowns through increased surveillance and harsher punishments for civil disobedience. The Vesuvius Edict, proclaimed by the provincial governor, establishes permanent military patrols throughout the city and creates legal frameworks for rapid suppression of any signs of social unrest. These measures address symptoms rather than causes, ensuring that future crises will produce similar results. The religious response to the crisis demonstrates how Roman spiritual systems adapt to catastrophic events while maintaining existing power structures. New temples are constructed and additional festivals established to honor gods who supposedly protected the city from complete destruction. The priesthood develops elaborate explanations for why divine favor was temporarily withdrawn and what actions citizens must take to prevent future disasters. These religious innovations serve primarily to redirect blame for the crisis away from systemic failures of Roman urban planning and social organization. Citizens are encouraged to view the breakdown as punishment for individual moral failings rather than evidence that their civilization contains inherent contradictions that make periodic collapse inevitable. The psychological impact on the broader population manifests in ways that transform daily life throughout the restored city. Trust between neighbors remains permanently degraded, as everyone knows that their fellow citizens proved capable of extreme violence when social controls weakened. Business relationships require new forms of security and verification that didn't exist before the crisis. Even family connections show strain as relatives who survived through different methods often find themselves unable to reconcile their conflicting experiences. Children who lived through the crisis display developmental problems that Roman educational systems can't address effectively. Many exhibit the same hypervigilant responses that characterize adult survivors, making them unsuitable for normal apprenticeships and social integration. These damaged young people form another category of marginal survivors whose existence challenges official narratives about successful restoration. The most profound consequence becomes apparent only months after normal order resumes. Pompeii has become a fundamentally different city inhabited by fundamentally different people. The social bonds, cultural assumptions, and behavioral norms that characterized pre-crisis society have been replaced by relationships based on mutual surveillance, defensive calculation, and barely suppressed awareness that civilization's protection is temporary and conditional. The beautiful Roman city that tourists admire in history books now exists only as physical architecture, housing a population psychologically prepared for the next breakdown whenever it might come. Years pass in the restored Pompeii, but the city never truly recovers the vibrant confidence that characterized its pre-crisis existence. What emerges instead is a harder, more suspicious version of Roman urban life, where the lessons learned during the breakdown become permanently embedded in social structures and individual psychology. The crisis has revealed truths about human nature and civilization that cannot be forgotten, transforming Pompeii into a living laboratory for understanding how societies adapt to the knowledge of their own fragility. The most significant long-term change involves the development of what could be called crisis culture, a set of social practices, economic arrangements, and political structures designed around the assumption that catastrophic breakdown is not only possible but inevitable. Citizens who lived through the chaos develop survival habits that persist long after normal order returns, creating behavioral patterns that seem paranoid to outsiders but reflect rational adaptation to demonstrated risks. Household management evolves to prioritize crisis preparedness over comfort or display. Wealthy families who once competed to showcase their prosperity through elaborate decorations and expensive furnishings now invest in hidden storage areas, escape routes, and defensive preparations. The beautiful atrium gardens that characterized Roman domestic architecture are modified to include secret water cisterns, food caches, and weapon stores accessible only to family members. Business practices adapt to incorporate lessons about how quickly commercial relationships can deteriorate into violent competition. Merchants develop backup supply networks that don't depend on local partnerships, while craftsmen learn multiple trades to avoid economic vulnerability. Credit arrangements that once relied on social trust are replaced by systems requiring immediate payment or tangible collateral, fundamentally altering the economic relationships that drive urban prosperity. The city's physical reconstruction reflects these psychological changes through architectural modifications that would have seemed unnecessary before the crisis. New buildings incorporate defensive features disguised as decorative elements, reinforced walls that can withstand assault, rooftop access points for escape or defense, and foundation designs that create hidden passages between structures. Public spaces are redesigned to prevent large gatherings that might transform into violent mobs. Political life adapts to the reality that Roman civic institutions proved completely inadequate during the crisis. The traditional magistrate system is supplemented by emergency protocols that can rapidly concentrate authority in military commanders during times of social stress. Citizens develop informal networks for sharing information about potential threats, creating surveillance systems that monitor both external dangers and internal subversion. Religious practices evolve to address spiritual questions raised by the crisis experience. New rituals emerge focused on preparing souls for violent death, while traditional ceremonies are modified to emphasize divine protection against human enemies rather than natural disasters. The priest class develops theological explanations for why gods permit civilized people to transform into killers, creating doctrines that normalize violence as a necessary element of divine order. Educational systems adapt to produce citizens capable of surviving future breakdowns. Children learn combat skills alongside traditional subjects, while moral instruction emphasizes loyalty to family and faction over abstract ethical principles. The curriculum includes practical training in resource scavenging, wound treatment, and threat assessment knowledge that would have seemed inappropriate for civilian education before the crisis. The most profound adaptation occurs in how Pompeians understand time and causality. The pre-crisis assumption that civilization provides stable foundations for long-term planning gives way to thinking focused on immediate survival and short-term advantage. Citizens make decisions based on worst-case scenarios rather than optimistic projections, creating social dynamics that prioritize security over growth and defense over development. Your own role in this transformed society illustrates how crisis survivors become living repositories of knowledge that normal citizens need but prefer to avoid confronting directly. The shadow community of damaged survivors serves as an unofficial consulting network for citizens preparing for future emergencies. People quietly seek advice about defensive preparations, resource stockpiling, and psychological techniques for managing extreme stress. This consultation process creates a strange form of social integration, where your marginal status becomes a source of specialized value. Citizens who maintain respectable positions in restored society recognize that your survival skills might prove essential during future crises, leading to relationships that bridge the gap between normal and shadow communities, while maintaining careful distance to avoid contamination by association. The knowledge you and other survivors possess becomes part of Pompeii's cultural inheritance. Unofficial wisdom passed down through families and communities about how to recognize early warning signs of social breakdown and what actions to take when normal institutions fail. This practical education exists alongside official history that emphasizes the restoration's success while minimizing discussion of the breakdown's causes or implications. Decades later, visitors to Pompeii notice subtle differences that distinguish it from other Roman cities. The citizens seem more watchful, the social interactions more formal, the commercial relationships more cautious. The city functions efficiently, but lacks the easy confidence that characterizes truly secure communities. Everyone understands, without discussing it openly, that they live in a place where civilization once collapsed completely and could collapse again. These behavioral adaptations become so thoroughly integrated into Pompeii's social fabric that younger generations, who didn't experience the original crisis, inherit its psychological patterns without understanding their origins. The city develops a cultural personality shaped by trauma that manifests in countless small ways, from architectural preferences to marriage customs to religious observances, creating a living monument to the fragility of human social arrangements. The restored Pompeii becomes a unique experiment in conscious adaptation to civilizational vulnerability, demonstrating both humanity's remarkable ability to learn from catastrophic experience and the permanent psychological costs of confronting the brutal realities that normal society prefers to ignore. The story of Pompeii's social collapse and the brutal survival challenges that preceded its famous volcanic burial remained hidden for nearly 2 millennia, but in fragments of evidence that modern archaeologists have only recently begun to piece together into a comprehensive understanding of what daily life actually meant for ordinary Romans living on civilization's razor edge. The traditional narrative of Pompeii as a prosperous Roman city frozen in time by volcanic catastrophe emerged from centuries of excavation focused primarily on recovering beautiful artifacts and spectacular architectural remains. Early archaeologists, working under the assumption that ancient Romans lived in a golden age of peace and prosperity, interpreted the evidence they found through the lens of romantic idealization that obscured the harsh realities of urban survival in the ancient world. Only in recent decades have modern researchers begun applying forensic techniques, statistical analysis, and comparative studies that reveal the true nature of Roman urban life. Advanced examination of skeletal remains shows malnutrition rates, disease patterns, and injury frequencies that paint a picture of constant physical stress far removed from classical idealization. Chemical analysis of water pipes reveals lead poisoning levels that would have caused widespread neurological damage, while examination of living spaces demonstrates overcrowding and sanitation conditions that made epidemic disease inevitable. Perhaps most revealing are the discoveries that don't make museum displays or tourist brochures the evidence of violence, desperation, and social breakdown that characterized normal Roman urban existence. Hidden caches of weapons found in residential areas suggest that home invasion and neighborhood warfare were routine concerns. Analysis of graffiti reveals not just the humorous messages that modern visitors find charming, but desperate pleas for help, threats of violence, and evidence of social tensions that regularly erupted into deadly conflict. Modern urban planners studying Roman city design recognize infrastructure patterns that prioritize control and defense over public welfare. The narrow streets that seem quaint to tourists were actually designed to facilitate military suppression of civil unrest. The public spaces celebrated for their grandeur served primarily as gathering points where authorities could monitor and control population movements. Even the famous Roman roads, admired for their engineering, were built primarily to enable rapid deployment of troops to suppress rebellions and maintain order through force. Contemporary sociologists examining Roman social structures identify patterns that help explain why cities like Pompeii were perpetually on the verge of catastrophic breakdown. The extreme inequality, the lack of social safety nets, the normalization of violence, and the absence of legal protections for most residents created conditions where even minor disruptions could trigger complete societal collapse. The crisis that transformed Pompeii into a war zone wasn't an aberration, it was the predictable result of social systems designed to extract maximum resources from human populations while providing minimal security or support in return. These insights force uncomfortable recognition of parallels between ancient Roman urban challenges and modern civilizational vulnerabilities. Contemporary cities with extreme inequality, inadequate infrastructure, and social tensions bear striking resemblances to the conditions that made Roman urban life so precarious. The same factors that made survival impossible for most people in ancient Pompeii's resource scarcity, institutional failure, social fragmentation, continue to threaten modern populations during natural disasters, economic crises, and political breakdowns. The psychological profiles of trauma survivors identified in modern Pompeii excavations match patterns observed in contemporary conflict zones and disaster areas. The adaptive behaviors that enabled survival during Roman social breakdown, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, predatory calculation, appear consistently in populations exposed to extreme stress regardless of historical period or cultural context. Human responses to civilizational collapse follow predictable patterns that transcend technological advancement or social progress. Perhaps most sobering is the recognition that the survival skills displayed by ancient Romans during crisis situations represent capabilities that most modern people have lost through dependence on complex systems and institutional protections. The physical hardiness, social ruthlessness, and psychological resilience that characterized successful Roman survivors developed through lifelong exposure to conditions that would overwhelm contemporary individuals within hours. Modern disaster preparedness experts studying Roman crisis management recognize that individual survival during societal breakdown requires capabilities that civilized society actively discourages. The empathy, cooperation, and moral constraints that make normal social life possible become deadly liabilities when institutional protections disappear and human relationships revert to predatory competition for scarce resources. The ultimate lesson of Pompeii's hidden history involves recognizing that civilization's benefits come with costs that most people prefer not to acknowledge. The security, comfort, and moral luxury of modern life depend on systems whose failure would recreate the conditions that made Roman urban existence a daily struggle for survival. Understanding how ordinary people lived and died in places like Pompeii provides essential perspective on both the achievements and vulnerabilities of human social organization. As we walk through Pompeii's restored streets today, admiring the architectural beauty and imagining the lives of ancient Romans, we're viewing a sanitized version of historical reality that obscures the brutal truth about what survival meant in the ancient world. The real Pompeii's, the city where a modern person wouldn't last a single day, remains buried beneath layers of romantic interpretation and wishful thinking about the past. The story of Gaius Brutidius and countless others like him reminds us that human civilization, no matter how advanced or sophisticated, remains fundamentally fragile, and that survival skills developed through necessity by our ancestors may prove essential again when the systems we depend on inevitably face their own moments of testing. The gentle Mediterranean breeze that whispers through Pompeii's ruins today carries echoes of voices that understood truths about human nature and social organization that comfortable modern life allows us to forget, until circumstances force us to remember. Still awake? If you found yourself drawn into tonight's mysteries, we've got more secrets waiting in the shadows. Just click to uncover what lies ahead. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so these late night revelations find their way to you whenever we unveil the next chapter